Good afternoon and welcome to the City Council Finance Committee meeting Thursday, January 19th, 2023. Yep, oh dear. We have two items on the agenda that I just lost. The first of which is the mid-year budget review with Mr. Francisco. Would you like to go, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, members of council. This is our mandated mid-year budget review. As you see it, it's mandated by what we call the Net Revenue Stabilization or Rainy Day Fund Ordinance. Once the council has received and approved the audit, based on those audited figures for fiscal year, in this case 22 closeout, we take a look at where we are in the budget year that we are in currently. And that's kind of what we're doing here, just kind of seeing how we're doing. One of the things you're mandated to do is to take a look at whether you want to make any changes in the rainy day fund, and we'll talk about that as well. I wanted to give just a little bit of an economic background for our discussion today, and this is based on your discussion of affordable housing the other day. Councilmember Lynn asked a question about interest rates, and I shot off my mouth and started to talk about an inverted yield curve. And I got a lot of questions about that after the meeting, so I wanted to talk a little bit about those of us who are, quasi-economists or certainly economic observers and investors like I am, study the yield curve religiously. Kind of what's going on. There are full curriculums of college about yield curve economics and the shape of the yield curve and how the yield curve is changing. Now, what you really want to look at is what is happening in the economy that is affecting the yield curve. And what the yield curve is basically the interest rate or the yield that is returned on investments in United States Treasuries given various maturities, okay? You've probably heard about the Federal Reserve aggressively changing the Fed funds rate, which keys to interest rates at the short end or the shorter maturities of the yield curve. And they've been making very aggressive actions at the short end of the yield curve, raising the Fed funds rate over the last year or so. And so that has really changed the yield curve dynamics that we are in as investors. And remember, we are investors. We invest the city's quote unquote idle funds. And as when we go into the markets to issue debt, which is what you were talking about the other day. As it relates to our potential for doing a debt issuance for a bridge project or something else related to general obligation bonds, the key point that I was trying to make clumsily in that statement was that we're in a very unusual yield curve environment right now because interest rates at the short end of the yield curve are actually higher than interest rates at the long end of the yield curve. This is very unusual. Usually there is what is called the risk-return trade-off, which means that the shorter end of the yield curve gives you a lower interest rate if you're an investor than the longer end of the yield curve because you have more and more uncertainty the longer you are investing and when you're going to get your money back when it matures. So right now, an investment in a United States Treasury that matures 1 month from now, this would be a 1 month T-bill, has an interest rate of about 4.6%. That's really, from an investor standpoint, that's really good. I invest a lot of the city's money in T-bills and T-notes and that sort of thing. And you'll recall when I was talking to the Finance Committee over the last really 10 years or so, that rate was down down not even on this scale.
It was like less than 1%.
Less than 1%. Okay. Now, why the Fed does that is that the Fed is concerned about inflation and is concerned about trying to curb the economy, really slow the economy down by making these changes in the Fed funds rate. But the impact of that right now is that if we went to the market today to do a bond issuance for that bridge project, we would actually have a lower interest rate on a 20-year bond than we would have on that 5-year bond that you talked about, okay? And that's unusual. So this is what you would call a very steeply inverted yield curve. Now, the other thing that I want you to notice is that this is just the difference in the last 2 weeks. So you see that the yield curve changes really rapidly sometimes, like it is now. I can't tell you what this is going to look like a year from now, or 6 months from now, when we actually may try to go out for a general obligation bond. But as it is right now, this is a very steeply inverted yield curve, creates a great opportunity for investments, but not a really good time to go out for a general obligation bond.
It's interesting.
I'm going to pass out some fund summaries here. And I'll ask Danielle to take up the extras, make sure that they get around. For those of you that have not met Danielle Reisenhoover, this is my new assistant. You have probably gotten used to hearing Ashley Evans' voice when you call the finance department. Danielle is our new administrative technician who will be answering the phones in the finance department now.
Good.
The first thing that I would point out in this first fund summary in the general fund is on line 1, the beginning fund balance. You see that at the time we adopted the budget for fiscal year 23, we thought we would have about a $15 million fund balance in column B. When we actually started this fiscal year, we had a $13 million fund balance in column C, line 1. And remember, these are audited figures now, so this is actual. The reason for that is that council made, because we had talked about our general fund balance is building up, and we talked about and encouraged council to, if you were going to spend down any of those fund balances, to do it for one-time capital sorts of projects. And you did that with these appropriations that you made toward the end of last fiscal year. You appropriated about $4 million to supplement the budgets for this general municipal complex renovation. So about $3.5 million for building C and about $300,000 for building B, and about $500,000, if you recall, to remove the asbestos in what is now the Development Center building. That, along with the studies that you appropriated money for and that we're currently doing RFPs and choosing vendors for, about $1.5 million. But all that taken together, you appropriated about $6 million of that surplus general fund balance at the end of last fiscal year. And I just wanted to point out that that's where we were. A lot of times I am accused of finding money at the end of the fiscal year when we do this mid-year review. That difference between where we budgeted and where we are actually has usually been more. But this year it's less because of these appropriation actions that you took. Again, we consider that to be prudent because they were for one-time things. Just a few things that I've highlighted here in the general fund that I wanted to talk about a little bit. On line 4, our sales tax is clocking along right on budget. We budgeted for a 2% increase, and we're about a 1.1% increase from last fiscal year so far this fiscal year, which is good. Again, these are estimates. We won't actually know until the end of the fiscal year where we stand, but where we are so far in the fiscal year, we're doing okay. Our use tax is up a little bit, and so we built in a little bit, about $1 million additional revenue projection from that source of revenue. Line 6, you see that we have been clocking along a little bit above our budget for franchise fees. But I was overhearing some discussions about the OG&E franchise as we were entering this meeting, and that is a big unknown. Okay, OG&E is the largest of our franchise revenues. They're about $3 million a year that we budget to come in from the OG&E franchise fees. Right now, we're not making any changes in that projection, but I don't know what's going to happen there. If they will continue to collect the franchise fee from their customers and pass them along to the city, they're not required to do that anymore. I don't know what's going to happen, but we haven't made any changes to that at this point in time. OG&E and OE City, our electrical franchises, pay monthly. So we will see in the coming months if they're going to make any changes to those collection and remittance processes to the city. But at this point, we haven't made any changes to our franchise fee projections. The other tax projections are down. That's basically the cigarette taxes that we get from the from the state. That has been down somewhat so far this fiscal year. Our fines and forfeiture revenues continue to be significantly down from our budget, and that is just because the number of citations is down. The other big change is in the other revenue category, and that is from outside grants, if you will. FEMA revenues are recorded here, that sort of thing. And we haven't received a lot of that revenue so far this fiscal year, and we'll continue to monitor that. You'll see that on line 33 through line 37, we haven't made any changes to our budget projections on the expenditure side. We usually don't. We know that we won't be exactly on budget, but we don't know what's going to happen in those areas, and we continue to monitor those things and report them to the Finance Committee on a monthly basis. The big change that you see there on line 45, that interfund transfer to the Public Safety Sales Tax Fund, that is for the armored vehicle. I almost said Bearcat. But that, again, as council directed, came from the general fund, and we paid for it out of the PSST fund.
So that says 972,000.
Remember, it wasn't just the Bearcat. It
Right.
was
So that's all the stuff.
all the stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's all. Is that the whole list?
Yes.
I thought it was over $1 million that we.
Yeah, but I think the PSST fund absorbed some of it. The change there in the transit fund is not really a change, but I would point out that that is for the micro transit program. As you see in fiscal year 22 in column A on line 46, we had a very small subsidy to the public transit fund. The public transit sales tax is also up, which really reduced the amount of subsidy that was needed to the public transit fund last fiscal year. But council directed that increase in the program for the micro transit program that's causing that subsidy to go back up. On line 50, you see that right now we are budgeting and expecting that we will expand the 1% emergency reserve. We always budget as if that will be expended and hope that it doesn't have to be. We haven't spent it so far this fiscal year. We're hoping that there's no ice storms. We hope that there's no big tornadoes or anything in the springtime that would necessitate our having to expend that money, but we budget as if we will. The other thing that I'd point out on line 55 is the employee turnover savings, which is basically an educated guess of the net impact in a given fiscal year of all of the employee turnover things that happen over the course of the year. Folks that retire, folks that resign, folks that are terminated, folks that are then hired in, usually at a lower salary than the person that they replaced. And on a net, Usually it works out to be about a 1.5% savings, and that's what we build into the fund summary budget. We won't know exactly what happens until it happens, but that's what we project for this purpose. All of those things taken together, we are projecting right now that we'll add about another $4 million to the general fund balance in this fiscal year and close this fiscal year with the general fund balance of about $17 million, which is about $14.5 million above your mandated minimums in the general fund. So the general fund continues to be in really good shape. You'll recall that we talked about that back when we were preparing the budget back in April. And we talked about this sales tax bubble that we were in that was causing these fund balances to build up. And we talked about, well, I don't know how long this will last. I don't know what's going on. We budgeted as if the bubble would stay there, would inflate just a little bit. And that's kind of where we have been. But we talked about the what if on the downside. What if we're down 2% or down 5% or down 2%? But so far this fiscal year, the bubble hasn't really inflated anymore, but it hasn't burst either. So we're doing okay in the general fund. We're doing quite well, actually. And we talked about on the upside back in April, if the bubble doesn't burst, we really probably ought to be thinking about some areas of additional services. We have tried to remain cautious and only spend that surplus general fund balance on one-time things. But if in fact this is a new reality, and we are in fact expecting to bring in more money over the long term, then we probably ought to be talking about some areas of added service. We talked about that back in April. Council directed at that time that these would be the major areas that you would see for additional staffing within the general fund. Is that a question, Councilman McGrath?
Yes, I did. Those 4 SROs and 2 dispatchers, weren't those originally, we promised to do that,
In the public safety sales tax fund, yes.
but wasn't that several years ago?
When the public safety sales tax 2 ordinance was passed, I believe in 2015,
Yeah.
that was included in that ordinance and mandated to be paid for out of the public safety sales tax fund. But the public safety sales tax fund until last year had not been meeting its expenses, and we knew that would be the case. That's why once the critical capital needs were paid for out of the public safety sales tax, the public safety sales tax by that ordinance will roll into the general fund. So that's why we're talking about these things as part of the general fund.
And that we couldn't add the dispatchers until the EOC is finished. Because there was no room to add any more workstations down there, apparently.
Not even a place for them to be working.
Right.
Not enough room for the
And-
wire.
And then the SRO
It's embarrassing.
is supposed to be cost share with NPS, and
Yeah.
They may not even
So
be
for the
wanting to
last
fund these at
fiscal
all.
years, we have not added those school resource officers, at least partially, from the standpoint that the school district has not said that they are in a financial position to add to their cost share for the school resource officers. The question here would be, if the general fund is in a position to fund that without additional contribution from the school district, should we add those school resource officers? And that's the discussion for council to have. If the schools district's contribution kind of remains flat, should we add the school resource officers anyway? The ordinance calls for a cost share. It doesn't say what the shares will be. This concept of 50-50 came out after the ordinance passed from the Public Safety Sales Tax Oversight Committee. And it has, over the years, been a consideration of 50% of what? Is it 50% of just the personnel? Is it 50% of the overtime? Is it 50% of the cars? But we have, over time, come to this 50%. But if the general fund is in a position to fund the additional school resource officers, that has been a priority identified by council if we were in a position to do it. So the question we will be posing at the end of this discussion is, do you want to revisit these priorities? Fire Station 10 is an identified priority, but that's 15 additional personnel. That's about $1.5 million per year just for personnel. And I want to emphasize that per year thing. As opposed to one-time expenditures, this would be about, the PSST would be about $600,000 per year. The stormwater personnel would be about $400,000 per year. The Fire Station 10 would be about $1.3 million per year. And that's what you have to keep in mind.
I keep that in mind, and I have no qualms with it whatsoever, because I believe that that is the very first thing, especially with fire and police. When it comes to our public safety, those should be our priority of budgeting. And I know other things.
Now, these were in order back in April, is it, in your,
This is the order that we have them in?
back in April, and the
I
question.
mean, that's not the order that I see them in. Stormwater, but when it comes to stormwater, doesn't matter if you don't have people that watch over houses burning down and rescuing people and not serving those needs. Those are the very main fundamental needs that this city exists to have services. So that's my priority, where that's at, is police and fire. The stormwater, I know, is a big issue, and we can get to that. But only after we fill those kind of needs first. That's my position on it.
Councilmember Grant?
Question on Station 10. Is it built? What's the timeline if it isn't?
No, it is not built. The public safety sales tax bonds that you issued as the NMA included one of those critical capital needs to be the reconstruction of Fire Station 5, moving it from one location to another with the existing personnel. This would be an additional station in a new location with additional personnel. So this is a real personnel discussion here.
What is the timeline to see? I mean, like between training and hiring and actually having a place for them to work at. Is that like a 2-year process?
Yeah, I would turn that discussion over to the HR director, to the fire chief, but I would think that it's about a year process. If you had the station built today, they would obviously start to advertise for the positions during the construction of the station so that the folks are on board and trained by the time the station opens. But I think it's about a year
Because
process.
I went to the groundbreaking today, and I did get to talk to somebody who was driving the bus from the church to the site, and he was telling me that critically understaffed. But I was curious, like, where do you see Station 10 in a timeline being built and then staffing?
So that's a great question. Thank you for that. So we proposed Station 10 in the area of Southeast 36 and Highway 9. There's a lot of already approved development down in that area. When you talk about Destin Landing and Bellatona already there and expanding. So that's what we had in mind. We turned over documentation to City Legal for the public safety study that we hope is upcoming to further study where fire station, the best placement of the fire station, so the biggest bang for the buck. We do know that area, it's a challenge for us to meet our response time objectives. As you know, our ISO rating is the best in the state of Oklahoma. So when we get audited for our fire response and how we deploy personnel, it's the best in the state. However, when we have development like that and we're not able to meet those response objectives, that could be put in jeopardy. I don't know at what point in the future it would be jeopardized, but it's certainly something we have to address at some point. So that area that I'm talking about is an area that we know about where we're going to have dense population coming to that area. We already have it coming into that area, and we struggle to meet our response time objectives.
So are we waiting on a public safety study to even, like, I guess that's a year, right? And then when it tells us where it needs to be, that's another year in
Well,
the construction pipeline?
If I'm not mistaken, that was approved by council, that study. So I don't know what the timeline of that study is, but we hope to be a part of that. And certainly it would shed more light. Not only in that, but the relocated Fire Station 5. We have a pretty good idea where that needs to be located, but it wouldn't hurt with the turnpike coming through, those sort of things. I think it would be good to have a third party look at that.
And then I had a question for Sean about stormwater. Meeting this need now, what would that do for us, like in the next year or two? Like, how does that help us?
This is one crew council member and one additional street sweeper, if I'm remembering the proposal. This is the same proposal that you've been looking at for about 12 years.
Oh,
The voters voted on it in 2016, it's in the stormwater master plan. Voted on 2016, voted on 2019, both those votes were rejected. So we have continued just to say, this is really what we need to maintain existing stormwater channels. A lot of it was kind of channel maintenance in areas that are just untouched. We just don't have the staff in Mob Creek, Merkle Creek, Brookhaven Creek, and that sort of thing. And then the street sweeping is a cleanliness and a water quality issue. We now have 4 street sweepers. When the mayor worked down there, we had 1. So we're making progress. But the goal is to have 6 to really meet those requirements. And so this would be the 5th one if you were to approve this.
this is like pretty low-hanging fruit for us in this budget.
Pretty basic. Certainly from a standpoint of stormwater management and maintenance, we've been understaffed for a long time. This gets us to a level that we think we can really make a dent. And just maintenance has been let go for many years.
Okay.
And it's also going to come to the standard that EPA wants us, or DEQ wants us, or those kinds of environmental things. It's
Yes,
not
sir.
just sticks off the street.
That's correct. You bet. Gets to the water quality issue as well. If I may, Mayor, I want to speak to the Fire Station 10 issue that
Yeah.
helped Chief out. Destin Landing is an 800-acre master plan. It's probably the biggest development master plan I've ever seen. It starts at
Biggest
really
development
Cedar Lane Road and goes south to Post Oaks, about 3 miles long and about a mile wide. Master plan was adopted by council in 2016, I think, maybe 2018, I think it's 2016.
15 or 16.
The developer's done nothing. They've not turned a blade of dirt, they've not planted any of it, none of it's moving. We have frequent conversations with them about phase 1, but it's a very small phase. So Destin Landing is a 20 or 30 year development.
Okay.
And nothing is happening there right now. If they got started tomorrow, we wouldn't see occupants in a house for another year. And you're not going to see 500 rooftops for another 5 to 10 years easily. So just kind of put that in perspective. And Destin Landing, the developer, Home Creations essentially, agreed to dedicate some land free to the city for Fire Station number 10. That's kind of where that idea originates. And Chief's exactly right. When all that gets built, we desperately need more fire service, but nothing's been built.
It was a Cindy Rosenthal. She got them to agree to that.
Yeah, it's a great thing.
That
It's
addition, that
wonderful.
dedication of.
And there are other homes around that area, but it was really about Destin Landing, this massive, mostly residential, multifamily residential development that was going to really overload our services. It just hasn't happened yet.
Thank you.
Councilman.
Okay, thanks Councilmember Grant for the questions, because those are a lot of the ones that I had about just thinking about prioritizing, but remind us, are we proposing that these be amended into the 23 budget, or are we looking forward now to the 24 budget?
It could be either. This is a discussion for council to talk about if you want to revisit those priorities. If, okay, and remember, this is what if,
Yeah.
okay? If you assume that we're in a new steady state of this higher general fund reality, then yes, we should be providing some additional services. And where would you prioritize those services to be added? During fiscal year 23, we have already added some, personnel in some areas animal welfare being the major one of them. But council needs to have the discussion of, if we are in a new reality, what are your priorities for adding services? And that's kind of how we want to couch this.
Okay, I think that helps and is fair. I mean, I think based on some of the discussions around, when Fire Station 10 is going to come online, that is not something that is currently, we don't have a timeline for that. I would say that it is a priority once all of the, items are set in motion for us to need Fire Station 10, but as it's standing today, it seems like that's not something that we should be budgeting and thinking and just holding money for 5 years until the station gets built. I mean, I think it's important to make sure that, we do have the response times, we keep our ISO rating, like those are all very important things, but I'm just concerned about, we don't know when that's coming online, when we're gonna need it, how long. Our public safety study, I think there are a lot of factors for me. So for personally, I would like to see some other options. I know that there's a long staffing list within every department of needs, and we looked at that a couple months back to see. I would say that stormwater is a pretty large priority for my ward. Specifically, we've got obviously several creeks that run through. So I continue to see that one as a priority, especially because that's something that is immediate. It's an immediate need. We could immediately deploy those new personnel into that will have, I think, an impact on our stormwater system. And that has been severely underfunded for decades. And I think there needs to be more conversation around, I guess, the PSST personnel. I think I would like to revisit the conversation with NPS and kind of see where they are with all of that. The dispatchers, I think, are a critical need, but we were waiting until the new ELC came online, and I think I'm absolutely a yes for prioritizing the 2 dispatchers, but for the RSOs, I'd like us to have another conversation about what that split is and maybe get something that's more concrete. I'm not opposed to having that be kind of where it is, but I think we need to have a further discussion about what they're willing to do, and just so that we understand the reality of what that budget cost is going to be if we decide to move forward with that out of the general fund.
I agree. I mean, they're all tied together. You talk about emergency response, like if we're not maintaining the creeks and they're flooding, then it doesn't matter how many police or fire we have if they can't get to it because the street's flooded or the bridge got washed out because we weren't properly maintaining the channel. So they all work together in a way. They're all intertwined in that way to me. So the maintenance crew would definitely be a priority for me. The street sweeper, I think, is a priority because we're under a mandate to reduce pollution into the lake, and that's a piece of it. I have the same kind of feelings about the other items. That Fire Station 10, we have no plan currently for it. The public safety study should tell us more definitely about when do we need it, where exactly do we need it. And I know that we have to get Fire Station 5 done before we could even talk about 10, really. And Fire Station 5, the PSST has a priority list that we've had to comply with, and we've done the emergency operation or emergency communication system, which was the first one, and then EOC is number 2. The ladder truck, we've already got that, and Fire Station number 5 relocation. So we got to get those done first. But outside of that, I agree. Once it's identified, Fire Station 10, and we're going to be building it when the funding's there, then I would absolutely agree that staffing it would be a big priority. And then
Definitely.
and then
Building a house without any.
yeah, and then the PSST personnel too. Like I said, yeah, same thing. With I think there's no disagreement with anybody about funding the dispatchers, those being a priority. We don't have anywhere to put those 2 extra dispatchers right now. And then the resource officers, it's, I guess, been sort of difficult to say okay, so should the city prioritize funding those positions for the school system when the school system doesn't think that they're a priority? Like MPS is not budgeting for those positions, so they don't believe that they are a priority for them at the moment.
I don't,
Well, they aren't, otherwise we would have funded our 2 of the 4
They
positions.
might not have enough funding. They might be
Well,
short
but
on funding for the
wouldn't
other
school
things.
resource officers be a top priority though? And if they were, wouldn't they say, look, we're cutting these other things because this is such an important thing. We're going to fund our 2 positions and we need you, the city, to fund
It
your
might
2.
also be what they're mandated to pay for first.
It could be.
I don't know how it works.
But it just,
so I'm not going to
it hasn't been shown to be a priority for them to fill those 4 positions. And so how could the city say, well, the school system doesn't think it's a priority, but we're going to do it anyway?
Which is why I
will
said
tell
that
you
we need
there
more
hadn't been a
conversation
priority.
about it before we decide.
I mean, their
right?
budget is their priority list and they aren't budgeting for it. So-
I'll tell you, and let's just be honest. There's not been a whole lot of priority to do business with Norman in many ways, and I don't know if that's it, but there's plenty of things that we can point to that people have not done business with Norman. Hopefully, we change that culture a little bit.
Well, we've partnered on all the other positions.
I know.
I mean, it's
I'm
been a
just
good
saying that
partnership.
that's realistic too.
let's have them come in.
And that's where I've been,
and
is
present
if
that.
the moment they've said, we're ready to go with those, to me, the voters of Norman said that we have an obligation to fund those positions. So I've been in the position of, whether you like the SRO system or not, that's what voters have voted for. We have an obligation to fulfill it until they say otherwise. But that, is MPS ready to do it or not? That's kind of where I've been.
I think so. We
If they
can
are, I'm
sidebar
ready.
that
Yeah.
one, 'cause I
We
know
will
it's-
talk a little bit more when we get to the Public Safety Sales Tax Fund, because I would point out that the school district does contribute about $700,000 a year now
Right.
to the SRO program. The question is additional.
Right. Right.
Right.
And also, I'd just like to point out that we have a school bond vote on the 14th, and if that doesn't pass, then I believe there's a little bit of overlap, but then some of those funds that they would have relied on for that bond money would be coming out of their general fund, which goes to pay teacher salaries and stuff. So maybe not a good time to talk about till we find out if they have money to even pay their teachers. So,
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you. And again, I have to go back to Anthony the Chicken Little guy. Just remember, this is a what if, and I failed to mention, talking about the yield curve, an inverted yield curve means that the market thinks things are turning down, that the economy is going to move towards recession, that sort of thing. That's why the yield curve inverts. A normal yield curve is upward sloping. And so just keep that in mind. It is not a bad thing to have fund balances high. It's not a bad thing to prepare for what might be bad times on the horizon. Chicken Little bad. Okay. Chicken Little bad. Shut up now. Okay. Moving on then to the Net Revenue Stabilization Fund, and I will point out that for the purposes of our viewing audience on YouTube or whatever, our fund summaries do not show up well on slides, and so that's why they're not there. So this discussion is based on what you have on paper. We will give them to you electronically on your laptops, but just know that they are not there on the PowerPoint presentation. The Net Revenue Stabilization Fund, which is better known as the Rainy Day Fund, again, you're mandated to have this review of where it actually stood at the end of the last fiscal year and where it is projected to be at the end of the current fiscal year. So you see that we actually started this fiscal year with a Rainy Day Fund balance of $4,168,000 on line 1 in column C. We are projecting that we will exceed our minimum down there at the bottom line, 4% rainy day fund balance, but we will be about $266,000 short of the targeted rainy day fund balance. So the question to council will be, do you want to make a deposit from the general fund to the rainy day fund to return it to its targeted balance?
And how much was that, you said?
$265,000 roughly. 265,777.
Is that to just, everything's just warm and fuzzy at that point if we do that?
It would meet its projected targeted
That's-
fund balance at the end of this fiscal year.
Does that hurt us in any way to do that?
No,
Okay.
you know, you have $14 million of surplus general fund balance. Your action would be to appropriate $265,000 of that to transfer to the rainy day fund.
Sorry, I didn't get called on there. I was jibber jabbering.
Yeah, that's all right.
My bad.
The last meeting, Mayor told us that was just
Yeah, that's
go
fine.
inside.
If it's just us in here and we don't talk over each other, I don't see a problem with it.
Yeah.
Easier.
So do I hear a consensus to prepare that action?
Yes.
Moving on then to the Public Safety Sales Tax Fund, and we've had a lot of this discussion already. We highlighted on line 13 the contribution that comes from the Norman Public School District for the current SRO program. It's about $664,000 this fiscal year. And we project that to increase by about 1%, 1.5% per year. But the Norman Public School District has not agreed to increase that for the additional 4 positions. So the question would be, do you want to just do that out of the general fund? The other thing that I would point out is that transfer from the general fund that we talked about for the equipment for the police department, and that is on line 11. You see there on line 26, the projected expenditure out of the Public Safety Sales Tax Fund this fiscal year for basically the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center. I know that some of you attended the groundbreaking for that facility today. We're projecting that that money will be spent in this fiscal year. The construction won't happen that quickly, but there will be expenditures coming out on that line in this fiscal year, and hopefully it'll be built in the next 12 months or so into fiscal year 24, but then that money will have been spent down.
The sign says summer 2024, so
Does it?
that's what the
That's
sign out front of it
possible.
says. Coming summer 2024.
The next fund that I just wanted to point out quickly is the special grant fund. I just wanted you to see that this is where we are accounting for the expenditures of the ARPA grant money. And you see that money coming in and going out, coming in on line 55 through 62, going
Need my
out.
magnifying glass.
This one came out sideways. Yeah.
Looks really good on my machine. You can see it just fine. But we just pointed out that that's where it's accounted for in the special grant fund. We don't budget for any of those revenues going in or expenditures going out. We just account for it there as it in fact happens when council contracts for those various grants. Next is the Seizures and Restitution Fund. You see that, again, we don't budget for any revenues coming in or expenditures going out of that fund. That was by council direction some years ago. In past years, we did budget for some expenditures to be made from those existing revenues in the Seizures and Restitution Fund. The mayor actually presented a great, what I thought was a great idea of using some of that available seizures of money to replace police cars. We have talked on many occasions about the shortfall that we have in available capital sales tax funds for vehicle replacements. Each year when the Fleet Maintenance Division comes out with the critical capital needs list for vehicle replacements, police cars are inevitably one of the major areas that we have to replace vehicles. If we replaced police cars with this $1.475 million of available seizure money, then that would be that much more money, or that would be available to replace every other vehicle, backhoes in the parks department or inspector vehicles or what have you. And so supplanting has become a bad word, but that's what we're talking about here. Paying for that critical need out of this revenue source so that we would have that revenue source available for other things. So again, that's just something for council to consider as the fiscal year 24 budget process proceeds. But if there are no objections at this level, then as the fleet department comes forward with that critical capital list, then we, as the city manager's budget is prepared, will jigger up and down with that critical capital needs list to pay for police vehicles out of the seizure fund and everything else out of the capital sales tax.
While I don't think that it's necessarily a bad suggestion, I think when we were having this discussion a month or two ago about seizure funds, we, as a council, I think, had asked to see more opportunities for how these expenditures could be used. So I wouldn't be okay approving this one targeted thing without having a fuller conversation about like how and seeing the guidelines and what they can be used on and having a larger council discussion about what we are going to do with this. Because I think that that's really where we were trying to go. So if it comes out that we have that larger discussion and this is the avenue that we want to go, great. Because I do see the value in being able to use, capital expenditures for other items. But I do believe that we should have a larger discussion on this fund in particular.
Yeah, same. I would definitely like for us to have a meeting where we can basically just lay it out. What are all of the legal uses that we can consider? What are the standards that are being applied for collecting these funds? Could we or should we have a higher standard? So maybe we still collect it, but we have a different standard for it. I don't know. But I'm definitely open to figuring out what to do with the funds we have on hand here for sure.
Definitely.
What to do with collecting future forfeiture funds is part of the conversation, but we have these funds on hand. There's nobody to give them back to. We do have to figure out what to do with them. So I'm very interested if we could arrange to have something where we, I don't know if it's the only item on the agenda, but where we just talk about the forfeiture fund and staff can lay out all the legal uses for it. And then we can figure out how we'd like to spend it.
That's scheduled for January 31st.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome.
Get your wish pretty quick.
Okay, so which then?
Thank you.
Okay.
She was like this.
Yes. Perfect, yes.
Look it up on the calendar.
Councilmember Randy Hughes.
Actually,
Asking
I was
Chelsea.
just echoing council members Holman and Schuler, and then, so 31st, gonna be there.
The next fund is the Public Transit Fund. And you see there, the sales tax revenues are up, which had kind of negated the need for a subsidy to that fund. But council has expanded the services paid for out of that fund in the micro transit program, which is kind of, you'll recall the study session and the consultant recommendation, the council kind of consensus adopted to roll out that program as kind of a nighttime and weekend expansion of the existing program. So again, from a financial perspective, this is what you see there. Okay, turning the page to the real Chicken Little stuff.
Oh, man.
The water fund, and
Listen up, everybody.
listen up, everybody. The water fund is in bad shape, y'all. And I would remind you to take off your council hat and put on your trustee of the Norman Utility Authority hat. You are fiduciaries of this water utility. Okay?
Yes.
So, on the revenue side, we continue to project that we will bring in about $25 million in revenue into the water utility from the user fees in various forms. We project that we will spend this fiscal year about $44 million, primarily on capital programs. And we will close this fiscal year with a fund balance of about $16,391,000. But that fund balance in fiscal year '23 is buffeted up by the revenue bond proceeds of the statewide revenue fund loan that council contracted for, and those revenues have been received on line 27, and the grant proceeds on line 28 for the automated meter reading program, okay? That money is in the bank, but that money can only be used for that advanced meter infrastructure program. So the financial picture, dire as it is really worse than what you see here. Because at the end of this fiscal year, there's $17 million in the bank that can only be used for that one purpose. And we're projecting to have an ending fund balance of $16.4 million. The bond proceeds for that one legal source is all that is holding up the fund balance in this fund this fiscal year. Okay, and again, as the treasurer of the Norman Utility Authority, I don't like this picture, and I don't like talking to the fiduciaries about it, but this is the reality. The water rate increase proposals that were talked about by the Raftelis consultants a few weeks ago, it's not like a fluff. It's not a thing that can be put off. It's a necessity. And when we talk about, okay, if we don't get the rate increase, we'll just put off the capital programs. Remember that you have contracted for a capital program for the advanced meter infrastructure that can't be used for anything else. The capital programs in the water utility, other than that, are just really the replacing the lines that, if a line goes out, we got to go out and fix it. Well, if we don't have money to go out and fix the lines that inevitably are going to break, we're going to have very upset customers for a very good reason, because their water pressure will be at zero. I don't know where it's going to be, but, there will be areas of town that will have no water pressure for an extended period of time because we can't fix their lines because we don't have the money to do it. That's where this utility is. And I can't overemphasize the dire straits that this fund is in. And you see that it gets worse over time. After we have spent down the money for the advanced meter infrastructure program, the fund balance goes negative by $11 million next fiscal year, $24 million the year after that. If there is no additional revenue, we're not going to be able to meet the basic needs of our water utility customers.
That type of deficit is not something the general fund could even subsidize.
No, sir.
Yeah, so that's, yeah.
Yeah, it is
Wouldn't
legal
really
for
wanna
the
do that
general
anyway,
fund
but-
to subsidize the water fund. It's legal.
Sure.
But is it prudent? No. Because again, there are thousands of residents of Norman who do not get services from our water utility. Why should their general fund be subsidizing? Again, we have had that principle in place since the 1970s.
The whole idea of a utility is that it stands on its own feet without the city's general fund.
Councilmember Gray?
We are trying to get another water rate on the ballot this year.
Do we what?
Are we doing another water rate on the
We
ballot?
haven't discussed it yet, and that's, to me, it's an imperative. but the voters haven't been, they haven't been kind in wanting that to happen. And the last time was 2 years ago, is that right? We took that?
When it failed, the most recent time?
It was last year.
It was about a year.
Year
A little
ago.
over a
And
year
so, and it was pretty resounding. And and to look at that and think, was that an informational thing? Was that anything else? There are all kinds of theories that go out there. They didn't trust us. All kinds of things go out. But the question is, this is the question. You got to have money to make it work. And how are we going to do that and still make it work? And we can't.
It's a rate increase is what makes
A
it
rate
work.
increase is the only thing that makes it work.
Well, and we weren't having this discussion last year either.
Yeah, well, it didn't look.
Wait,
this
it didn't
bad
look
last
this
year.
bad when we went out for the rate increase. So I think we've learned things in the last 8 to 9 months that I think really changed the picture. And so maybe it's not just like, oh, we're gonna do AMI and we're gonna do, something else. It's like, this is a critical need and you will not have water.
Yeah.
Like it is that dire at
It
this
is.
point. And that's not like,
That's not chicken.
oh,
Little.
that's not Chicken Little. Like that is the reality based on what we're looking on the financial side.
And
of
then to
this.
even get up there, back to having water, we need $25 million,
Right.
which is, where's that gonna come from? So that's that magic sack that you've got buried out there in the back.
Yeah, and
Well,
Interestingly, when we moved from the building C to the development center, people moved into my old office looking for the safe, and they didn't find it.
That wasn't stacked to
secret
the-
safe with the stash in it. Yeah, well, as of this month, it's now been 8 years since the last water rate increase, so. And before that, again, was 9. So 2 water rate increases since 1999, which I think was the one before 2006, so 2 rate increases in 23 years.
And the
Pretty
question,
good deal for the Norman
it
residents.
is a
I
pretty
think.
good deal. We are the cheapest. We saw that presentation here just a little bit ago. And the situation is dire and has to be resolved.
TRUST.
So how do you plan out like when you should vote on it? Like when ideally should we
It should
be
have been
trying
every
again?
2 years over those last 8 years that we go in there, or every year over those last 8 years, but it hasn't been taken care of because it wasn't a popular thing to argue about. As you say, it was hard to get the statistics, things were projected. Well, this is a little bit of a projection, but this is pretty short term.
I mean, it's next year.
Yeah.
Councils have been doing this for several decades, where it's like, it's difficult to ask, so until staff comes and says, well, this is like a real dire situation now, then the council's like, okay, let's do it. Because it's just, because we have to ask for water, wastewater, sanitation, all the bonds. We vote more in Norman than anywhere else. It's hard to ask. There's never a good time.
Of it coming out of the general fund, as Anthony was saying, is not fair to the other people who aren't actually on our water. So that
not
would be a
sustainable
reason
either.
for them.
To vote.
Like there's a fund balance now, but 5 years ago we were looking at the projection out to now was negative every year in the general fund. So, I mean, it looks good right now, but it's not a stable funding source like ratepayers are. So,
The next fund is the water reclamation. Was there another question? The next fund is the water reclamation fund.
See us moving in a direction to kind of discuss getting it on a ballot this year.
Agreed.
yeah.
Yeah.
When the consultants from Raftellus recommended that there should be a sewer rate increase as well, not as large as the recommended water rate increase, I was kind of surprised. But looking at the water reclamation fund, it also is in a position of needing additional revenues to meet its current states of expenditure, okay? Now, the sewer fund, the water reclamation fund can muddle through, as we have muddled through in the water fund for many years. But just keep in mind that in this current fiscal year, if we continue with the capital program that you see on line 33, which we're projecting that we will spend $10.7 million this fiscal year on capital projects in the Water Reclamation Fund, it will end this fiscal year in the red. That is illegal. Now, I don't think we will spend that much money on capital programs in the Water Reclamation Fund, even though we are clocking along and doing those projects now. We probably won't spend down that money that quickly. But just know that to meet the capital program that is in place now in the sewer fund, it needs more money.
Councilmember?
Do they put Councilman Holman in jail if that happens? Asking for a friend.
I remind each of you to take off your council member hat, put on your Norman Utility Authority trustee hat, and that trustee word is important. That's why I'm almost like kind of embarrassed when I, stand up there in front of you and I'm the only one of my colleague department heads who will address you as trustee, okay? Chairperson Heikkila, not mayor, Chairperson Heikkila. Trustee Holman, you gotta remember that you have a different hat on when you're talking about these utility enterprises. It is a sub-business, but you are the fiduciary of that business. And yes, if this in fact goes red, you're all breaking the law.
Wouldn't be the
Two
first time.
We got a lawyer on the council.
I don't break the law.
Represent us all.
Well, then let's get some money.
Let's get some money.
And it's been November 2013 was the last rate increase for this one, I think. Yeah.
And it wasn't very much.
Is there a thought to strategy for asking for rate increases on either one of these? I know you said, Mayor Heikkila, like a 2-year cycle for the water rate.
That's my personal thing, would be a year and then 2 years, and that conversation's been going, but it hasn't been all of us together. And so it's, a lot of it's gonna be how much mud do you want to have thrown at you, how fast? And, because it's gonna be a difficult uphill battle to be able to get the people to understand why. And a lot of that is explanations. Face-to-face, I think, does a lot better than a written program. But we have to explain, just as Anthony explained to us, we are these fiduciaries that have to find the money to be able to do that. This isn't a personal thing against the city. The city in itself, it's kind of a political statement, but the city, some of the voters in the city have decided that they will use the vote to be able to discipline us. This isn't a place where that works. We are responsible as adults to make sure that we are always in the black. And that's what we're doing. It's got nothing to do with policies or.
So you can see us having 2 rate increase votes this year, like one for the.
I love it, but, I mean, we're voting every month, it seems.
I mean, it's an odd year, so you get more
We get
elections.
more elections.
Councilmember?
You asked for it. Here's the winning strategy. Quit spending people's money on social programs of any kind,
Well, no, hold on.
and they will trust you to
Different-
vote on this stuff. That is where we're at
Different
on these
fund.
votes.
Different
But
fund.
then other people will not,
It
because they'll
doesn't-
say the city's not spending money on
Well,
social stuff.
actually-
It's just a back and
Anyway,
forth.
Mr. Francisco, would you like?
Strategy. That's the winning
There's people
strategy.
that are gonna vote no because they didn't like Bria Clark, they'll vote no.
I mean, I think there's some education around the difference between an enterprise fund
If you vote
and
yes,
our general
because if
fund.
you
So
vote
that's a
yes,
conversation that we could have. Like, why are these different?
Yeah.
Why are we having different conversations about our utilities as opposed to the other funds that we have
General
within
fund
the city?
basis, yeah.
Right,
Because these are specifically a whole nother corporation.
right.
I just would like to point out, we did do a study and after that rate increase failed last April, that kind of gave us a map of where people were.
Yeah.
And yeah, I would encourage everybody to go back over that again before we launch into another.
But it didn't deal specifically with exactly what he said, what Mr. Francisco is saying. This issue is different than why they were mad at us. What that was mad at the city. This is a different corporation, as it were, a different organization that has to run this water and wastewater fund. And so they can be mad at the city all they want. They can be mad at me all they want. but this indicates that we have to get more money in. We have to charge more for the services we're selling, which is water and wastewater. And we have to get that money back in there to be able to keep it going. Just no gas, no car.
We're not even asking for any extras. We're asking just to keep it going. Yeah, this one could be difficult too, putting them both up for an election close to each other because water rate, water reclamation, they sound the same. And
Yeah.
So there's a strategy.
it's like people are going to be like, wait, am I voting in this? Am I being asked to approve the same thing twice, or am I being double taxed here?
Well, that'll be
What's
up
water
to us.
reclamation?
It'll be up to us to educate, do those kinds of things, go to the Kiwanis clubs, go to everything else and explain it to them.
Is that what worked last time? Since, I mean, like, you were on council.
Now it's
I
been so
no.
long.
Like, since it passed, you were still staying, like, you were on council?
Yeah, I mean, then it had been, again, we were able to say it's been several years. And with the water rate, when we got that passed in 2015, it had been since 2006, and a rate had failed in 2011. So, and it was a different atmosphere.
So we
Like,
weren't like this.
the public in general seemed more willing to vote for stuff. Now it's a little bit different. I feel like there's like a no mentality, even regardless of any of us being up here, that it's like, I'm not voting yes on anything. Like the OG&E, that didn't really involve us.
No.
People voted based on their opinion of the company, I think. It has gotten more difficult for sure, and things have gotten tougher economically, pocketbook, asking people to increase their rents increasing, other things are increasing, other utilities are increasing, and they don't get a vote in those. So they say, well, I get a vote on this one. I'm not raising my monthly bill, you know? So it's difficult. It's definitely going to take a lot of face-to-face, I agree, if we're going to get really any of these initiatives through, even ones that seem like they would be slam dunk. You know, just can't take any of them for granted anymore, I guess.
So that, I guess, is when we put our council hat on.
Anthony, do you think, well, is it required by law, and do you think that the city council should be the trustees of the utility? Or
It's
should it be
certainly
a
not
separate-
required by law.
Like, would it be better if it wasn't the city council, if it was a different body?
You're asking for my opinion, but my
Your opinion,
opinion
yes.
is based on my experience in other cities, and this is the only city that I have worked for where the council is the utility authority, or the airport trust, or the TIF authority. It's usually 2 or 3 council members as members
Might be
of a 5 or 7 or 9-member trust, but certainly not a voting majority. That's very unusual.
Something we might want to think about going forward too, because it's hard for us to take our hats off, I think.
It is.
It's hard to wear 2 hats as a council member, I think, because we can never really fully disassociate ourselves from the political
Yeah.
aspect of what we do.
And that's the why the hospital has a good time, because it's not entirely divorced, but almost divorced from it.
Yeah.
But I got to remind you, we've only got a few more minutes, so.
Moving quickly through, the next fund is the New Development Excise Tax Fund. This is the tax that was imposed in 2001 that is paid at the time of building permits. You see that we project revenues of about $1.1 million from residential excise tax payments, $300,000 from commercial excise tax payments. We're roughly on budget for those revenues. What I wanted to point out here was this fund has a major capital program on line 26 that is key toward the Southeast Lift Station project. The Southeast Lift Station project is a payback project. We have $6 million going out for that project next fiscal year. There will be a proposed payback ordinance that the developers in that area would upfront the cost for that project and then be paid back as customers tie into that lift station. Those revenues are not reflected here. So just know that hopefully this revenue and expenditure picture is worse than it will be once that payback ordinance is approved. But right now, it goes negative next year if we do that project without the revenues coming from the developer. Wanted to kind of exhale and say the sanitation fund's okay.
Yeah. It goes up over the next 2 years.
Yeah.
So just to recap, some decision factors that you have, you talked about the rainy day fund and you project, you've directed that we'll prepare that deposit to the rainy day fund. You've talked about the additional capital programs or ongoing expenses. What do we want to do with that general fund surplus if we are in fact in a new normal? Those staffing priorities, those ARPA program priorities, you'll want to discuss that as we're going into next budget year. The micro transit program we talked about, the water rate increase, we kind of covered these things. We've kind of gotten some consensus direction that we will carry forward into the preparation of the fiscal year 24 budget process. But I just want to thank you for all that you've done so far to give us that direction. And just know that that's what we'll be doing as we're preparing the fiscal year 24 budget. Right up until the time that budget is adopted, you can always change things, but this is part of the budget process. And just know that it is informed by the information that we get throughout the process. So, you know, yes, we've had some bad news here, we've had some good news here, but the important thing is that we've had news here. So I appreciate all of your input.
Thanks, Anthony.
Questions, comments, thoughts?
We have another item, don't we?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Monthly.
We have another item.
Oh,
don't we?
yes, we do.
That's all I have.
Yeah, I wasn't going to highlight anything related to the monthly revenue and expenditure reports that you get. We've kind of covered where we are. But if you have any questions, I'll try to respond to them. Always, sales tax is key to the February return, which is sales during the month of December. Voter and consumer behavior is kind of spreading out the holiday shopping period. So that January sales tax return that we've gotten, which is reflecting November, is becoming a larger proportion of the annual sales tax that we get. So when I'm telling you that we're clocking along about a 1% growth, that's more confident than we would usually have been for where we will be at the end of the fiscal year, but we'll be more confident after February. And we'll be more confident after March and more confident after April.
Is that long a tail?
The important thing is that it's not just 1/12 per month,
Got it.
okay? There is a concentration in August, which is our October sales tax remittance. There's a concentration used to be really concentrated in February, but it's now concentrated January, February. So we'll have a really good feel for where we're going to be around February the 10th.
And that 1.5%, that's an increase from our historic high last year.
Yes, sir.
So it's significantly ahead of where we were a few years ago.
Yes.
Kind of curious, is that inflation driven? Like what explains it?
Inflation is a contributor, but it's really an indication of a pretty good underlying economy. And the question will be, where will we be going from there?
So that yield curve says we're going tanking, right?
Yield curve would indicate that, yeah, the bubble's going to burst. I mean, you know, and I don't know. I can't say.
But we're in a college
Yes,
town, so it
we're-
might be less of a blow to us when
Yeah.
it does happen.
Prognostications are all worth the same, aren't they?
Yeah, it's a new world. I used to really pride myself on making these projections and reading what's going on in the economy. But lately, I have no clue. I don't
Day to
know.
day.
Yeah.
Somebody could tweet something and it causes the stock market to crash.
Well, and I heard a presentation from the lady who's the economist, or one of the economists at the Fed in Oklahoma City, or Kansas City, however you figure. And she was having a problem with the same question. It was just, it doesn't make sense. This isn't classic anything, this is something.
Classic anything.
And so,
Don't quote me on the no clue thing.
I missed that.
Good, okay.
all right. Well, I guess we are done. Thank you, Bryce.